Hello, and welcome to the online lecture for History 1102 for September 24th, Monday, where I'm going to deal with an overview of what we will call the Atlantic revolutions, that is to say, the American, the French, and the Haitian revolutions. Today's class is sort of an overview, and then on Wednesday we'll deal in some more detail, based on the primary sources for the French Revolution. We'll also talk at least about one of the paintings that I'm going to discuss here, so keep listening. Let me just quickly recap, of course, before as this slide suggests, I'll recap what we talked about the Enlightenment last Wednesday, then walk us through North America and spend quite a lot of time on France, because I think it's more important, not just because I'm biased. And then deal with what's called at the time Saint-Domingue, or Haiti, to think about sort of this set of revolutions that take place politically that are going to have very far-reaching impacts. To recap what we talked about before, with the Enlightenment, argued that it's this intellectual movement in the 18th century, centered in Europe, that has some core similarities. The writers of the Enlightenment are attacking particularly the Catholic Church and organized religion in general, the certainties of religion. They're defending the ability of humans to reason their way through the world, to think about and understand their place in the world through their own intellect. And in general, it's a defense of liberty, the freedoms that people should be able to have. On Wednesday, talked about the fact that there are certainly different degrees of defenses of liberty. Montesquieu clearly argues that liberty is innate, or it's dependent on society. It's guaranteed by laws, and the separation of powers is necessary to prevent liberty from being impinged upon or infringed. Other later writers, particularly someone like Rousseau, writing later in the 1770s, 1780s, he's going to argue not just for liberty, but increasingly going to use the R word to talk about rights, that all men are born free and equal in rights, that they give up some of their natural liberties to gain the political liberties of being associated in the social contract. So at the very least, these varieties of intellectuals are thinking about, the ideal structure of society, and are envisioning one that is not necessarily more equal. That's certainly part of it, where more men typically in their imagination have a say in what's going on. And so certainly just by existing this way, this is an implied criticism of the existing political structure. Again, in most of the 18th century, everywhere in the world, particularly in Europe, most of the existing structure revolves around single monarchs and hereditary monarchies who assert their own ability to rule over wealthy landowners. So the Enlightenment certainly matters because it, on the surface, does critique this world. It's diffused, and this is also why it matters, is because people start reading. It gets out to more and more people. It's diffused through a growing literary world of scientific academies, cafes, salons, private rooms where people gather and talk about readings. This is what we come to call the public sphere, the idea that there's a space in society that's not connected to the government, to the state, where like-minded people can come together and discuss things. And as we'll see, that's not insignificant when we talk about the French Revolution. Of course, there are real limits to the reach of this. Enlightenment thinkers themselves don't really conceive of women as having the ability to participate, of having liberties and or rights, as not really being real citizens, because they were irrational. Also, this is an era when not everybody can read, of course, but certainly texts are diffused. They're getting out beyond, even despite general low literacy levels, right? You have newspapers that circulate and people read them aloud, and plays that people read aloud, or et cetera, et cetera. So the printed page, the works of not just Diderot, but other kinds of printed material, not just Montesquieu and Diderot and all those others, their printed works have a life, gain new life in this period, or gain a life beyond just the fact that they wrote them. And so the diffusion of these sorts of ideas, many of which are kind of critical of the old order, connects to the part of the story that I really want to tell today, which is the intellectual and political revolutions in the Atlantic world. They're not going to just overthrow the kind of a existing political order, but are going to have, as we'll see in the weeks to follow, really lasting impacts on the shape of the modern world. So that's where I'm going to go here. The kind of run up to these Atlantic revolutions, want to deal with just a little bit of business. That is the conflict of the 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, which takes place between 1756 and 1763. This is essentially a global clash between France and Great Britain in places like the Caribbean and in India, in what is now Canada, well, in British and French North America. They're clashing for supremacy abroad. There's also some fighting on the European continent between two German-speaking states, Prussia and Austria. We don't really care a lot about that. The upshot of all this is, I just pointed out that France and Great Britain clash over India, North America, the West Indies, that is to say, Jamaica, the Sugar Islands of the Caribbean. The end result, which is what is important, is that Great Britain kind of inadvertently inherits an expanded empire. I should point out that it wins this war by the fact that its navy is that much superior to the French navy. It inherits an expanded empire, sort of what was formerly French Canada, what is now Quebec. That sort of expands British North America. But also it gains much more of a foothold in India, particularly. The French are kind of pushed out of India. And I've argued up at this point that the European footholds in India are pretty insignificant, and that's still true, but it's really after 1763 that the British, and in particular, the private business, the British East India Company that gets sort of an open run at things after 1763, for a while at least. The British East India Company is going to build up its own, basically, sort of mini empire as an agent of British colonialism. So it's not the British government saying, let's build an empire. It's basically a private business that has government support that's increasingly behaving like a territorial state, as we'll see in the weeks to come, carving out territory for itself, impinging on the sort of the authority of the Mughals and on the Marathas in the south. So the point here is that Britain comes out of the 7 Years' War enhanced. France is in debt and angry, both of which are important for the revolutions to come. This painting, by the way, is Robert Clive, basically the employee of the British East India Company, whose native Indian allies win for him the battle at Plassey, which kind of pushes the French out of that part of India in 1756. Of the three Atlantic revolutions, I would argue actually the sort of the least important is the North American, is the one in the United States. And I know that sounds horribly shocking, perhaps, but here's my rationale for it. Of course, the revolution begins with a Declaration of Independence in 1776, a somewhat unlikely military victory by 1781, and a federal constitution in 1787. My question, though, is really how revolutionary was the American Revolution? And the answer is, I think, less than we might think. I mean, yes and no, like many things in history. The American Revolution is born out of efforts on the part of the British government to tighten its control and extract more revenue, get more money out of its North American colonies. And the result, sort of the resistance in the American colonies, and then sort of fighting, and then overthrowing, sort of casting off British authority, is certainly a political change. Of course, right? The British are no longer in charge in the 13 colonies. They are still in Canada. So that's an argument for the radicality of the American Revolution, but it's quite conservative in other ways because it essentially preserves the state of affairs for colonies that actually had a great deal of autonomy before 1776. That is to say, the North American colonies let's be clear, for white property-holding men, were far more open and free, and the colonies themselves had far more sort of autonomy than other parts of the world. So British North America is a far more open society than, say, Western Europe or Tokugawa Japan or Qing Dynasty China. And the revolution kind of just confirms that. It certainly accelerates the democratic tendencies in the American colonies. Um, for instance, in the wake of the Constitution, at the state level, some states do away with requirements to hold property in order to vote in elections. Vermont, for instance, gets rid of property requirements, and other former colonies, other of the former American colonies, lower their requirements. In a place like New Jersey, there's some real confusion after the state's constitution is drafted. Women actually are allowed to vote in the 1790s before somebody closes that loophole, and women don't vote there again until the early 20th century. So the point being here is that the American Revolution, yes, it certainly casts off the British in North America, creates an independent entity. But basically, that just sort of confirms it confirms the relative autonomy and relative freedom at least for property holding white men in these colonies that existed beforehand. It just sort of shifts who's in charge. Overall, certainly there is more democracy here already and then after the revolution. But I think that what's not so radical about the American Revolution, as we'll see with the French one, it does not challenge the very idea of a monarch. It just sort of insists that George III is not the monarch for the Americas. And that's one of the reasons why I think the French Revolution is quite so radical. The French Revolution is really this landmark moment that calls into question the very nature of authority, the very nature of monarchy, and in the years to follow, eliminate the the old order, set the groundwork for the modern nation. Again, that's sort of in the years to follow, not just immediately after the French Revolution. Show you here a map of what's called the Ancien Regime, that is to say, the old regime, France before 1789. And you can look at that map on the right. It does not look to be a terribly rational, even-handed map. That's a France of regions that are on the map that way because they existed partially that way in the Middle Ages. What helps explain the revolution is certainly by the 1770s, there is a real current public opinion, like we've talked about with the Enlightenment, that is in favor of reform, some sort of reform to the political structure that's going to allow for more people to have input, basically. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. There's just the question is what form that reform will take. So in the 1770s and 1780s, the French state has all sorts of problems. It is massively in debt. It has a huge debt from having to fight, basically bankrolling the American Revolution, also even from the 7 Years' War, 20 years previously. So the problems that the French monarchy faces, on the one hand, is that it doesn't have money, and it's in debt, and there are things that are preventing it from raising more money, and this is what I call institutional blockages. The nature of the whole old order in Europe in the 18th century, and this is probably also true elsewhere around the world, is that people's world is defined by privilege, what they get to do, what other people have to do for them. And one of the privileges of being a so-called noble member of the landowning nobility, that means you have a title. In France, at least, and it's true also elsewhere, is that you were certainly exempt from paying direct taxes, not income taxes even, the direct head tax, which was borne largely by much poorer and less fortunate people than you. So this is one of the key problems of the French state before 1789, is that it has financial problems and it can't tax its most wealthy citizens, and I mentioned nobles, but also the Catholic Church as a whole is a big institution. And it too is exempt from a lot of taxation, and so that's one huge financial problem. There also are increasingly, groups, and I put the Parlement here. Those are the old law courts. They kind of had been not doing a whole lot. The law courts that date back to the Middle Ages. Montesquieu was actually a member of a law court. And historically, they claimed the privilege to basically sign off on laws passed by the king. And in the 1770s and 1780s, there's the regional parliaments, Parlement, whether in Paris or elsewhere in France, and there's several of them, are increasingly hostile to the king, arguing that they should have some sort of consultative, some sort of voice in the process. So ironically, actually, these institutions are going to use the language of the Enlightenment, sort of greater democratic liberty, to demand really what they think are special favors that are owed to them because of their position, privileges that date back to the Middle Ages. So, all of which to say, however, is that the French state has real problems, and that's what motivates the king's ministers in 1788 to summon this representative assembly called the Estates General. This is not like a Congress in the sense that it's not everybody is voting here, but basically, as you will note from the reading, the Estates General is sort of an older body that hasn't met since 1614 that assembles representatives from the three estates. The first estate is the church. The second estate is the nobility, the landowning people with fancy titles. And the third estate is everybody else. Back when it met in 1614, the first two estates, each estate got one vote, so the first two estates could outvote the third one. In 1788, there's a real discussion about basically when the king calls the Estates General. Various, all these little regions of France prepare the members of the third estate in a particular little area meet and nominate a representative, and they send him, because it's men in this era, to go to Paris, Versailles actually, with instructions of grievances to bring up, problems that they want to address. Right? So this is an assembly comprised of representatives of the three estates from all over France. And at this point, nobody is envisioning anything more dramatic than possibly a constitutional monarchy, like the one already present in England. Everybody agrees that there needs to be some sort of change. No one is quite sure what's going to happen. And that then leads to the summoning of the Estates General in early 1789, and there's some real argument about how it's going to sit, and whether the third estate's going to get whether the third estate is going to get more representatives because it's bigger. Eventually, they agreed on that, yes. But there's still sort of back and forth going on. In June, actually, by this point, the members of the third estate, again, basically everyone who's not special, doesn't have a noble title or isn't part of the church. So merchants, lawyers, shopkeepers, other kinds of artisans, theoretically peasants and other workers, but they're not here. By and large, the delegates to what becomes the National Assembly are all sort of men of letters, doctors, lawyers, merchants, etc. It's a very famous painting by Jacques-Louis David of this moment called the Tennis Court Oath, where the delegates had been previously from the Third Estate. They're now breaking away and calling themselves the National Assembly, because they argue that they're the whole nation. They don't need the others. Basically, they're locked out of their normal meeting hall. They meet on an indoor tennis court. It's not really tennis, it's actually handball. And they vow to stay together until a constitution is produced. And this painting is a very dramatic representation of that. And we're going to come back in class. We're going to start analyzing this painting. So be prepared. Have your art history hats on. The way that this is being framed, composed, the different people, what they seem to be doing, what message it seems to be conveying. David obviously painted this a couple years later about this moment. What story is it trying to tell about the early revolution? So on the one hand, you have sort of these discussions about reform going on. There also is violence in the countryside as peasants are burning down the houses of their noble landlords. There's violence in Paris. The Bastille prison is stormed by the crowd. Right, so they have this dynamic of popular violence and sort of high-minded legislators meeting together. And that's really the dynamic of the revolution itself. And just to give you a few kind of key points in the chronology. Oh, just kidding. In early August, it's now the National Assembly, so the whole Estates General thing that never really gets off the ground because there's so much debate about how it's going to meet, that the Third Estate meets separately, calls itself the National Assembly, and then delegates from the other estates trickle in and join it as a body where everyone is a delegate as opposed to representing the Third Estate or the nobility. The National Assembly spontaneously abolishes what I put here as feudal duties. That is to say, the things, again, that typically these were things that peasants or workers, particularly peasants, had to do for their title-holding landlords. So for the dukes and counts, etc. Peasants had to do things like They had to do 2 weeks of unpaid labor on the roads or on the estate of their noble landlord. They had to, in some cases, mill their flour in his mill, or bring him a chicken at every Easter. The unpaid labor was the biggest problem, and so the assembly here early on gets rid of some of these requirements that sort of the things that average people had to do for people with privilege. And this is followed shortly by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which we're actually going to talk about in class, so I'm not going to spend much time on it here, other than to point out that this is, again, sort of a set of principles. It begins with the declaration that all men are born free and equal in rights, which is a pretty sweeping statement, particularly in a world for the French that contains slavery. I'll come back to that point too. Also in here are some demands for things like freedom of the press, assembly, right to a speedy trial, etc. Things that, again, look very familiar, coming out of this Enlightenment critique of the irrational old order. In the early phases of the what we'll call the revolution, really the basic consensus for most of the people in the National Assembly is that monarchy is still acceptable, and some sort of constitutional monarchy is really the best result. Still, there's some problems that make the revolution radical and kind of derail it from being just a simple reform. One is what to do about the church, which of course had been this big landowner and also a really privileged institution of the old order. So in July of 1790, the Assembly passes essentially the civil constitution of the clergy, which more or less turns priests into salaried employees of the state, gets rid of monasteries, and it sells off most of the church's lands. The church owns a ton of property in order to make money. It basically declares church land to be national property. And it demands an oath of loyalty from priests. At least half of them don't swear it. And so this is a big wedge issue, if you want to think about it that way. It's going to turn a lot of people, it's going to, on the one hand, make the revolution more and more radical. It's going to turn a lot of people against it. We mentioned during this period that the sentiment seems to be that the goal would be to produce a constitutional monarchy. But that, as resistance to the revolution rises, there is increasing really sort of doubt about that. The king himself also is clearly not on board with the revolution. In fact, he tries to run away in June of 1791. He gets caught at the frontier and brought back. Even though, again, people are in favor of a constitutional monarchy, there is growing suspicion about this monarchy in general. And also, from about mid-1792 onward, France is at war with its monarchical neighbors, with the Austrian Habsburgs particularly. And this really radicalizes the revolution. The threat of invasion causes the people of Paris to take over the National Assembly in September of 1792. It's renamed as the National Convention. This is a period when the revolution is going to be much more directly democratic. The people of Paris are going to sort of sit in on the assembly, kind of watching it. This is the period when the king is put on trial for treason and executed quite narrowly in early 1793. And shortly thereafter, France is at war with just about everybody else in Europe. There's also, who are sort of on its frontiers. There's also a massive revolt going on in Western France, in the area called the Vendée, over men being conscripted to go fight in the revolutionary armies. Also, a revolution in support of the old Catholic order. And this is partially what explains the so-called Reign of Terror between June 1793 and July 1794. We think of this as a period of just people chopping off heads. This is the Vendée, by the way. It's the area out there in Western France. There's also another kind of revolt going on against the revolution, but we don't need to talk about that here. During the terror, of course, part of it is dealing with these, basically dealing with the external threat, the invaders from outside, by having a draft, the levée en masse, dealing with sort of outright revolution in the countryside. It's also stifling dissent, that is to say, sort of arresting people for theoretically being opposed to the revolution. Our image of this is that, it was just poor aristocrats who were being executed here, like Marie Antoinette, etc., the wife of the queen, who was eventually executed in the Reign of Terror. Most of the people killed during the Reign of Terror in Paris, and there are about 20,000 of them, are just average people who run afoul of the revolutionary government. So certainly this is a period of intensified violence, but it's also sort of an experiment in a revolution. So the government controls the price of bread and other staples. It's also when the French Assembly abolishes slavery. As I'll explain, this is basically to try to deal with the chaos going on in what is now Haiti. And it's not entirely done in good faith, but it is an abolition of slavery, as well as, I was just kidding, I should point out, religious minorities like Jews and Protestants get full civic rights during this period. There's an attempt to change the way people think about the world with creating a revolutionary calendar that's, I'll talk more about this next week. It's actually a 12 30-day months. Each month is divided into 3 10-day weeks. You can do the math. That doesn't quite add up to 365 or 66, so they're bonus days at the end of the year to make it correspond with the Earth's path around the sun. And the months are all named after natural phenomenon. Call them like the 7 dwarfs. So you have like Fructidor, which means fruity, and Brumaire, which means foggy. You just need dopey and happy in there, and you've got the whole lot. A joke, but naming months after natural phenomenon as opposed to, I don't know, Roman gods or other things associated with the church. So this is really the revolution that's most intense, but of course this doesn't last. This is an image, by the way, of the Festival of the Supreme Being, which was an attempt to kind of create an alternate religion in support of the revolution. It doesn't really go anywhere, but it involved like big parades and a papier-mâché mountain. Festivities for everybody. So the terror comes to a close in July 1794. Basically, enough members of the National Assembly, which has renamed itself, but whatever, are upset about economic price controls, and so they basically push aside or have executed the main architect of the terror, a man named Maximilien Robespierre. What follows is sort of a backing away from the most directly democratic moments of the revolution. There's a period called the Directory from July 1794 to 1799, where once again, if during the terror and even before, after 1792, more and more adult men could vote in elections for the assembly, after 1794, that's once again it's only men of property, increasingly just rich men. In 1799, as I'll talk about in a week, the director is overthrown by an ambitious young, I guess he's a general at that point, corporal, Napoleon Bonaparte, or as he's known at the time, or just before this, Napoleone Bonaparte, because he comes from this backwater island of Corsica that had only recently become part of France, and he's, where they speak essentially Italian. So that's sort of the overview of the arc of the revolution. And I think, again, what I would suggest is really that at no point does anyone set out to kind of, in 1788, no one is cognizant of what's going to happen. The revolution begins as this reform process that intensifies due to, both behavior of the sort of the men of the revolution, but also due to things like war, what to do about the church, uprisings, etc. So the revolution kind of radicalizes itself as it goes along, and it ultimately, as I would suggest for you, challenges the whole idea of the legitimacy of the monarch. Right? Even though for much of the French Revolution, there's accept the idea that really what they just want is a constitutional monarchy, that ultimately, executing the king is a pretty bold statement. It says essentially not just we're okay with monarchy, just not this one. It's a rejection of monarchy as a principle, and instead it's an embrace of the nation as the main sort of source of sovereignty, as to say, legitimacy for any government. I'll come back to that next week. But I wanted to sketch at least sort of the broad overview of this for you before we discuss it in detail on Wednesday when we talk about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and the Declaration of Woman by Olympe de Gouges. Let me just sort of conclude this Atlantic Revolution's overview by talking about what happens on the island of Saint-Domingue, which is otherwise known as Haiti, which is, if you look at the map there's Florida, and then there's Cuba below it, and then Saint-Domingue, or the island that now is Haiti and the Dominican Republic, is immediately to the east. So here it is. The western part is under French control. Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue is the richest colony in the world, arguably, before 1789. It has 8,000 plantations, produces 40% of the world's sugar, half the world's coffee. It's home to really a mixed population, um, one that is divided between about 40,000 whites, and they're split up between, as I'll talk about, sort of rich whites and poor whites. About 30,000 free men of color, who are known in French as gens de couleur libre, and about 500,000 slaves. Now, when the revolution breaks out in 1789, it's greeted in different ways by all these different groups. So the group that I've identified here is the Grand Blanc, the big whites. These are things like plantation owners and merchants, maybe wealthy lawyers. And for them, the French Revolution really, when the news of it, seems to offer a break from the economic trading system that they were under before 1789, where they had to sell all of their sugar and coffee. They had to go back to mainland France. What the Grand Blanc mostly want to do is trade with the United States because it's a big market right nearby. And so the revolution seems to promise that they will have greater freedom to do what they want. Their place from below their place is being threatened from below, however, by the Petit Blanc, the little whites. These are like shopkeepers, sort of indentured farmers, men who are not as wealthy. A lot of them are recent migrants to Saint-Domingue. And for them, the French Revolution seems to offer the promise of equal citizenship with the rich whites. Both groups resist the gens de couleur, the free men of color, men and women of color. In Saint-Domingue, there was a substantial mixed race or free black population. And many of these men, and some women too, were quite wealthy. They owned plantations, owned slaves in their own rights a lot of the time. They had seen their position worsen on the island from about the 1760s onward. They were increasingly restricted in their ability to own property, to serve in the militia, etc. So for them, the revolution seems to promise equality of citizenship with the whites. None of those three groups at all have any interest at all in abolishing slavery, and see themselves as very distant from the enslaved black population, which again, as I pointed out, is 500,000 strong. The slaves, when news of the revolution gets out, slaves, of course, are going to want their freedom. They're also going to want an end to the misery that they're leading. There's sort of this confused jockeying on the island between 1789 and 1791, where the free men of color and the various whites are trying to, they're demanding various things from Paris, but they're also trying to assert their power locally. But what happens is increasingly the whites, the color line essentially is what determines sort of how people behave, and the free whites, the Grand Blanc and the Petit Blanc, the wealthy whites and the less wealthy whites side against the free men of color in the local assemblies. And back in Paris, there's not much being done because the National Assembly doesn't really want to abolish slavery. A massive slave insurrection breaks out in 1791. And this is going to cause all sorts of shifts on the island. Basically, the free men of color are going to sort of gravitate into the camp of the former slaves because they see race as being sort of the inescapable element here that that they'll never be able to get past in terms of the way that the whites perceive them. And so the free men of color increasingly see that they're not going to be included in a post-revolutionary Haiti. And so they eventually sort of get most of the men of supporting the slave insurrection, which leads eventually, and I'll come back to this next week, to an independent state, Haiti, in 1804. I should point out, so the slave revolt begins in 1791, and part is an effort to stop this. And this is why the National Assembly in 1793 abolishes slavery. Actually, I think it's early 1794. Abolishes slavery in all French territories, basically in an attempt to try to prevent the slaves who are revolting from doing so, and trying to persuade them to go back to working on the plantations. Somehow the slaves are not convinced that this is a great idea. And so which I think is, and I pointed out, then there's all sorts of fighting, and there's other complicated things that I can talk about next week. leading to the creation of an independent Haiti in 1804. Um, what to make of the Haitian Revolution? And again, I'll deal with this in more detail later, but I want to include it here because I think it's easy to dismiss it as sort of a sideshow of the French Revolution. But I would argue that the Haitian Revolution actually forces the revolutionaries back in Paris to really think about what the meaning of what they're doing is. Um, you know, in Saint-Domingue, there is essentially a large population of people who take issue with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens' insistence that all men are born free and equal in rights. Well, they're going to point out, is that true? Does this mean, men who had been formerly enslaved or men of a different skin color? And by and large, the response to the French Revolution is not really, just kidding. So, but of course, that does lead in a variety of ways to the abolition of slavery in the French territories, at least during this period. And so I think that the Haitian Revolution then is really kind of forces the French Revolution, just like the sort of popular disturbances in the cities and other riots and moments of violence or war that drive the revolution itself in a more radical direction. The Haitian Revolution forces the revolution, at least on paper, the Revolution back in France, to really sort of follow through on what it's promising and sort of, at least temporarily, mandate a kind of equality and abolish slavery, which is a fairly dramatic change. We'll talk about the limits of that when we come back. We'll talk about it this next week. For Wednesday, do come prepared to discuss the primary source readings. We'll do that in groups and make up stuff about a painting. We'll think about the revolution in more detail. So, hope that made sense. Thanks much. I'll see you on Wednesday.